Okay, so Route 66. We started that this last week, and that's what we're in. The 66 books of the Bible represented on that road trip. We're looking in the Old and the New Testament. We're looking at themes and key verses and key words and the application that each book of the Bible brings to us. You know, along those lines, did you know the Bible itself actually has kind of a general theme? The Bible itself as a whole kind of has a general theme. I mean, it's God's inspired word to us, so it's God's breaking into the world to establish his rule. This is the history of God revealing himself through creation and through the molded process of creating what he wanted to be on earth. And we're working right now through the first 5 books, because the first 5 books are a collection, the books of the law, or our big word that we used. Anybody remember what that big word was? Pentateuch. Yes, all right. Hey, bonus points to those online on Facebook if you can spell it correctly in the comments. All right. There. Now, the Pentateuch itself is a representation of that theme of the Bible, of God breaking in to establish his rule, but specifically over the people of Abraham, to establish his nation, to establish the founding of a theocracy, a nation that is truly ruled by the one and only true God. And now, last week we tied this in as we started in Route 66 with the book of Genesis. And Genesis was teaching us that everything begins with God. And I said that everything has a beginning. And afterwards, John Johnson looks at me and goes, I wanted to speak up and say, no, it doesn't. There's one thing that doesn't have a beginning. And I said, okay. And he said, God. God doesn't have a beginning, and God doesn't have an end. And it's true. Thus making the statement itself that everything begins with God even that much more on point, factually true. Now, God, in the beginning of his rule, selected and blessed the seed of Abraham through the covenant he made with him. We saw that the omnipotent God creates, the sovereign God selects, the righteous God blesses good and curses evil, and the gracious God saves. So there's the quick recap for you as we move from there into the second book of the law, the book of Exodus. And Exodus has a few just simple facts about it for you to know. The author, again, is attributed to Moses, and once again done after the Exodus from Egypt. But Exodus, unlike Genesis, was recorded in order to show the continued fulfillment of God's promise through the Abrahamic covenant. And we see that there are 40 chapters that make up Exodus. Not quite as long as Genesis, but 40 chapters that make up the book of Exodus. Now, if we were to define the book of Exodus, we might say that it is a book of redemption. We see a redemptive process in the stories that we read about God saving his people out of slavery and giving them a new constitution as he establishes that nation in a new way, in a new life, in a new process after taking them out of Egypt. Simply stated, the way we're going to look at Exodus this morning is this: God draws us to himself. God draws us to himself. Now, that picture that's painted of coming out of Egypt and moving forward, it makes our key word pretty easy. I'm going to make it simple this morning. Key word is exit. Exit. It's about getting out of what we shouldn't be in to get to where we should be. A few key references for you to consider: chapter 3, verse 14, chapter 15, verses 2 and 21, and of course, chapter 20, verses 3 through 17, because that is the 10 Commandments. Those might be essential parts of the book of Exodus. Now, this idea of exit, of being drawn out, is encompassed greatly through the almighty power of God and what our key verse is this morning, and that's Exodus 22, that says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. God draws us out. God gives us an exit point from the slavery that we're in. Now, there is structural aspects, as there is to every book with Exodus. There's kind of 2 specific areas that Exodus breaks down into as an overall picture, and that is liberation and constitution. But more specifically, there are subpoints. There are a breakdown of these ideas to what the liberation is and what that constitution is. So the structure and the outline looks a little bit like this. Chapters 1 through 15 is the liberation process. We see a crisis, slavery. in chapters 1 through 5. So what does God do? He confronts it. There's confrontation in chapters 6 through 10. And then there is liberation in chapters 11 through 15 as he takes his people out of the slavery. And then we see the constitution aspect come in the rest of the book from 16 to 40. There's another crisis, though. There's disorder. Now they've come out of where they had a regular process in Egypt, and now there's disorder in chapter 16 to 18 as they enter the wilderness. And so God has to give them instruction. And so he does that. He gives them an instruction, a constitution to live by in chapters 19 through 24, including the 10 Commandments. And then they follow by obedience in chapters 25 through 40. And we know, though, that obedience, when we read it, kind of does this sort of process, as we all do in life. And one of the best ways to describe the book of Exodus, because we talked about how we define it, but there's also a great descriptive process to this book. And that's epic. Exodus is an epic book. Epic is unforgettable. It's exciting. It's connecting. Have you ever watched a movie where you're so drawn into it that you almost want to go into the movie? It's like something about it just makes you go, I'm just empowered right now because of what I'm watching. This story, these characters, everything that they are, I want to be a part of it. Anybody ever been in a movie where they've experienced that process? Maybe better yet is this: has there ever been a particular character in a movie, whether it's a hero or whether it's a villain, that you wanted to either like walk right alongside the hero, or you really want to jump into the screen and just wring the villain's neck with every ounce of energy that you had? That's what it is when it's epic. It draws you in from where you are, and it puts you inside of it and makes you want to be a part of it. It connects you to it. And Exodus is epic because it tells stories of epic adventures with epic characters, the most significant being that of the conflicting battle when God sends Moses and he and Pharaoh they just go at it time and time again. And the images we see throughout this book, we see a burning bush, or maybe we should say sort of a burning bush, because it gave the appearance that it was burning, but it wasn't actually on fire burning. The Nile turns to blood, the Red Sea parts, pillars of fire and cloud, Mount Sinai and the tabernacle. These epic images within these stories and the adventure that Exodus gives us. And as we unfold this, what we begin to see is a true picture, really, through Israel's process of the imagery of the epic of the new covenant that is yet still to come. But there is a process that God does as he moves through this, and it's connected to our theme this morning. See, number one, God draws us out. Just like he did with the salvation of Israel and removing them from Egypt, he shows that as a picture of our rescue to a life in Christ. And then God draws us in. And he draws us in. He made himself to dwell amongst the people of Israel, just that he desires to dwell within our heart and have a relationship that is growing each and every day with each one of us. And it gives us a realization that God draws us and rescues us from our slavery. And then he seeks to use our lives as a backdrop to draw closer to us in relationship and draw himself to us. So let's get into this and the ideas of that process that God uses. And it's first that God draws us out. And this is represented in those first 15 chapters of Exodus. And why does he draw us out? Well, he starts by drawing us out because we are helpless. On our own, we are helpless. Just as Israel was helpless. This is the crisis of slavery that we deal with, that Israel dealt with. Egypt has enslaved God's people at this point in time. It was their bondage now. It was what held them back from being able to be in the life that God desired for them, a life lived fully in connection and relationship with him. In Exodus 1:11, it says, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens, and they built for Pharaoh store cities of Pithom and Ramses." It's kind of like a picture of what we're like before Jesus. We're helpless before we believe truly in that relationship that he wants with us. We're slaves to the sin that inflicts us. Think of it like this. It's like the helpless baby in the womb. When you're in there and it's just a picture of no control by the individual. There's a need for something more, but then God draws us out in this process, and he draws us out through the process of what? Salvation. Salvation. He draws us out through his process of salvation. And salvation, sometimes we refer to salvation as what? Think of it as the baby in the womb. The baby is born into new life, new birth. This is what salvation, that picture in reality of that helpless baby being newly born. It's a supernatural process that God has created when that happens, but it's almost like an unbelievable picture to see the supernatural growth that happened within the nation of Israel during this time. See, what ends up happening in this process is that Exodus begins to answer a lot of the questions that Genesis left off. We start to see what Genesis left hanging come to light in Exodus. As Joseph saves his family and brings them to Egypt, he's put in a place where God could use him to continue the nation. And so they come to Egypt, but scholars will predict at that time there may have been about 70 members of the family that came. Approximately 70 members of the family that came. So this is a small nation. Nothing that anybody would fear at that point in time. But they'll calculate that over the period of time that elapses in their process there, approximately 430 years, that the nation would grow, and it would grow by almost 5 per family. So what happens is you've got, each of them are having 5 kids, and each of their 5 kids are having 5 kids. And if you multiply this up over that time, what you get is you go from what was predicted to be about 70 people to 2.5 million people in the nation of Israel. And they grow up in this process, and they build, and God supernaturally over this time, just in amazing ways, builds his nation, continues to fulfill his promise to Abraham, and he does it amongst the Egyptian culture. And what happens is, as Pharaoh and Egypt begin to recognize what's happening, they begin to see this supernatural growth that is happening. These people are multiplying greater than the Egyptians are, and they start to feel overrun by the Israelites. A fear begins to well up in the people of Egypt, and so Pharaoh issues a command. All of the firstborn males of the Israelites are to be killed. So now how will escape come for the children of Israel? How is it possible that they're going to be able to escape from this if there's going to be murder of their people? As a comedian once said, the big number 10, Moses. Moses. And the picture that's painted, he's put in a basket, he's put in the Nile, he's put amongst some reeds on the bank, and the Egyptian princess finds him, and she draws him what? Out of the water. It's one of those epic images, the imagery that God creates in this. Moses is drawn, his basket is drawn up out of the water. Like us in birth, we're drawn from the water in the womb, and like new life in Christ, like baptism, we are drawn from the water. We're put under the old life. That which was is gone, and when we come up, new birth, new life is created. It's the rescue of God. Just as it was when Moses was drawn from the water, it was God's plan in his rescue for his people from their slavery. We were helpless. Israel was helpless, but then number 2, God goes to battle for us. This is the confrontation process. And let me tell you, that epic adventure that we talk about in Exodus, it gets real when God goes to battle. Let me ask you, how many of you know that any time you see God going to battle in any way, you know it's epic? Oh, it is absolutely epic. It is epic in ways that absolutely blows our minds. So here we go. Moses is drawn from the water. He goes through his entire process as this prince of Egypt. He kills one of the Egyptians who's beating upon the Israelites. He joins them. Then he has to escape because of that murder. But then God calls him through the burning bush and says, I'm sending you back to Pharaoh. And what is Moses' initial reaction? Me? Yeah, that's funny, God. But God shows him how he's going to do this. He sends him back, and he sends it back to Pharaoh. And what is it that Moses tells Pharaoh? Let my people go. Those 4 words, I'll tell you what, when you think about it coming from the mouth of Moses to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's kind of going, yeah, okay, whatever. But think about that concept coming from the voice of God. Let my people go. Could anyone say no to that? I mean, Pharaoh tried. First he questions, okay, man, let your people go. All right, who sent you? The Lord God sent me. Who sent you? I am, the great I am. And Pharaoh's response in Exodus 5:2, but Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. See, Pharaoh at this time doesn't realize technically who he's actually dealing with. He thinks he's dealing with Moses, and he doesn't know this God of Moses. He does not know the God of Israel. Pharaoh himself believes himself to be a sovereign. He believes that he is an ultimate authority in the land of Egypt. And the only authority that he bows to is the Egyptian gods, those that he serves, the false gods of their own man-made creation and thought. But remember from Genesis, the God of Israel is what? Our God is an omnipotent God. He is the all-powerful God. He is the sovereign God. And he now marches with his show of all-powerful authority. He's using Moses and Aaron to do it, but he begins the epic show of superiority. And he does so over what Egypt worships. He uses these 10 plagues, and I'm just going to give a few of them for example. And it's funny. He uses what surrounds the idea of Egypt's worship against them. God's sense of humor, it's not just an epic story. God's using satire. He's using comedy. He's using tragedy. Everything you can think of is in the book of Exodus, and it's unbelievably funny in this aspect. As terrible as the plagues are to inflict upon a people, God's sense of humor is wrapped up in this. And we just overlook it many times. Here's what he uses to show his power. Number one, they worship the Nile. They worship the water that flowed through the land. And so God turned the Nile to blood. They worshiped the idea of fertility. What was their symbol of fertility? Frogs. So God sends frogs, a plague of frogs, all over the place, everywhere. Can't go anywhere without stepping on a frog. They worship the weather and the power that it brings. So what's God do? He sends hail, and he sends thunder, and he sends lightning. He goes, okay, if it's destructive, you're still going to worship it? And then they worship the earth, and they worship the ground and the crops, and they have their deities that take care of that. So what's he do? He sends locusts. He sends locusts to destroy their crops. He's one by one, he's taking down these things that they worship. One by one, he's going, you think that there's this power in that, but you have no idea what real power is. And then Egypt's primary god. Does anybody know what Egypt's primary god was? Ra. Amun-Ra. Amun-Ra was the god of the sun, the god of light. He was the one that gave the power to everything else. So what does God do? Well, in the 9th plague, 3 days of sheer darkness. Says, okay, you think that's so powerful? I'll show you who controls it. God shows his power in battle for us. And he did that with Israel too. He does it for both of us so that number 3, he can draw us out and save us. This is the liberation process in the first part of Exodus. For us, he provided a supernatural deliverance through the blood of his son that he sent to die on the cross, drawing us out of our slavery to sin. And this is just as he draws Israel from the slavery that they were inflicted upon in Egypt. And the way that he pushes his power to save, he does it with the 10th plague. He does it with the 10th plague. One of the worst things you could possibly think of. But at the same time, he turns it around and returns Egypt's own order right back against it. The death of all the firstborn sons of Egypt, even Pharaoh's. And God's salvation is supernatural even here. Even with Israel, it's a supernatural process, but through a command for obedience. They had to be obedient to what he said in this process. This is all from chapter 12, but it's broken down to keep it a little bit more simplified. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for the household, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This is the Passover. How many of us are familiar with the idea of Passover? This is where the tradition comes. This is where their celebration of that comes in the Jewish tradition. Is for us, Christ is called what? The Passover lamb. See, they had to follow obedience. They had these lambs for 14 days, and they slaughtered them. They took the blood, and they rubbed it over the doorpost. When the angel of death came through, he would see that, and he would go, nope, not there. And he would move on to the next house. And this was how God was protecting. Isn't it amazing? It's through the power of blood that salvation comes to the people of Israel. The 9th and the 10th plagues, so unbelievably characteristic of the God that we serve and the power that he shows and the imagery that he creates between his deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt and the deliverance that he offers us in our lives. On the 9th, when there were 3 days of darkness that covered Egypt, when Jesus was on the cross, there was 3 hours of darkness, and then he only spent 3 days in the darkness of a tomb. In the 10th, the firstborn son of Egypt dies. God sent his only son to die. This is salvation. This is a beautiful picture of the fulfillment of what he did for Israel and what he does for us and what's to come. And now he's put Israel in this prime position to leave Egypt. But when they do, they end up still traveling defenseless. They don't have weapons. They don't have all of this stuff to defend themselves. He wants them to rely on him, and so they have to rely on him. Otherwise, they're helpless against the armies of Egypt. And here we come to the Red Sea, and here again the picture is painted. God has now drawn them out, but then God is going to save. Exodus 14:18, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. The waters part. The people walk through on dry land. Again, think of this picture. Out of the water they come on the other side, onto the banks of new life, a new nation created for God. This is also a picture of the birth of that true nation of Israel. Exodus 14:30 and 31. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. See, they rejoiced in this salvation. They recognized, they believed. This new idea of this nation was established in faith. Faith that they didn't need to fight in the battles unless they were told. Instead, a faith in God. They sang songs and they danced and they rejoiced. I'll sing unto the Lord, for he saved us victoriously. The horse and rider have been thrown into the sea. David paints this again in Psalms 18. He drew me out of many waters. When we're drowning in those places, God draws us out, and after God draws us out, then God draws us in. This is the process of our salvation becoming a sanctification process. It's God's process of grace. In Jeremiah 31, the prophet speaks on behalf of the Lord and reminds us that he's loved us with an everlasting love. His faithfulness is going to continue to the generations to come. And he has a desire for us to, he says, let me redeem you. Let me mold you like I did with Israel. But what do? We do what Israel did. When God draws us in, we start in the first place, we kind of take a step back and we cry in the wilderness. This is the crisis of disorder that we see. Even though God has drawn them from slavery and saved them, the Israelites, they start to complain. They start to whine about their situation in the wilderness. And they grumble to Moses and Aaron over and over and over again, eventually to the point of completely thinking backwards. Exodus 17:3, but the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Now, this is just over water, but I mean, think about it. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And here they're saying, why did you do this, Moses? I mean, seriously. Think of everything we had. They're starting to think positively. Like they start to think positively that backwards moving the idea. I mean, at least in Egypt, we had everything we needed. I mean, I got to go home from work every day, and I had a meal on the table and a bed to sleep in. And now you've got us out here in the wilderness, and I don't have anywhere to sleep, and I'm on the ground, and I don't have any water, and if I want food, I got to figure out how to find it for myself. How many of us do this in our lives? Those moments when God is trying to draw us in and we cry out in the wilderness, and God says, hey, relax, just come to me. And we respond by looking behind us or looking where we're at in that time and thinking, but this might be easier. That was easier. That was more fun. I mean, God, I see what you're trying to do, but I'm not so sure I want the difficulty that's going to come in following you like that. That seems really hard. I don't know if I want to do that. I want the easy path. God goes, okay, fine. Here, I'll give you a solution. I'm going to give you a solution. I'm going to provide you a solution, okay? I'm going to give you a path to walk, and I'm going to give it to you in 10 easy statements. God reveals himself and gives his word to guide us. This is his instruction. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, man. He comes down and he's radiating with the glory of God. And God delivers his revelation in his word, the 10 commandments. He's saying, I'll provide everything, guys. And here's my word to help you. Here's what you need. I've got it right here for you. Just trust me. I love you. Just follow me. I got this. And like Israel, it is this way with us in our lives with Jesus. We struggle day in and day out, but he's saying, I love you. I got this. Just follow me. Trust me. I'll take care of it. I provided that salvation. Now just live in it and trust me to take care of it. And so thus God draws us to himself as we follow his word. He gave us the instruction. Now it's up to us to be obedient. And it happens through trial and error, just like it did with Israel. There's bumps in the road. There are roller coaster days that we go through, but there's also amazing signs of joy and of faith that represent. We all have stories in our own lives of the process we've gone through, and we know none of us have ever been perfect with it. There's always been struggle points. Just like the stories of Israel, those epic stories. Like the first time Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, he's got the 10 commandments, and what does he find? He finds the people annoyed that he was up there and they were down there alone, and so they melded all the gold together and created a golden image calf that they were worshiping. Not the greatest idea. Moses breaks the original tablets that God had already scribbled out and made for him. He melts down the calf, puts it in the water. They got to drink this gold-inflicted water, and it's disgusting. But then later on, after the commandments are renewed, Moses goes back up, gets them again, comes down, and we see a picture of Moses teaching this word to the whole nation, and the nation sitting there just engulfed in what's being told to them. And the pillars of cloud that guide the people by day as they wander toward the promised land, and the pillar of fire at night so they can see what they're doing. And then ultimately God's instruction for the tabernacle, and they build the tabernacle so God can be in the midst of his people. He can live with them in the midst of them. And how epic the picture is, the last verse of Exodus, chapter 40, verse 38. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. He was with them throughout all their journeys. And he wants to do the same with us. He desires to do the same with us. He chose to live in their presence just as he desires to live each day in relationship with us. He'll do anything, guys, anything to draw us into his possession. In this picture we see painted these two sides. You've got God and us, and you've got God and Israel. and captured so beautifully in Exodus 19. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. He draws us out, and then he draws us in. Our lives are a picture of a rescue story. There's huge rescue stories going on right now that maybe some of you are aware of and some may not be. A giant issue that the media just glosses over these days is human trafficking. And it's happening everywhere. But there's organizations fighting this, and they're fighting this in the name of God. They're fighting this in His love. They're representative of the salvation. See, there's an organization, you're going to hear more about this from me because I want you guys to know about this rescue organization called Destiny Rescue. These guys go into these districts. They're over in Thailand and the Philippines and in these third world countries. They go in, and these men go in undercover. And they start by building a relationship with these girls, but they do it in a respectful way. They're not like the other men that are in there. And these girls start to recognize this. And they find a way to be able to pay the mamazan, the one that is in charge of these girls, to say, I just want to buy the girl from you. I don't want to buy one time. I want to buy the girl. And they'll buy the girl. And so they're drawing her out of the life that she's trapped in the slavery of that. And then they take her to a safe house, and that's where they begin to draw her in. Because they start teaching them about the love of Jesus and saying, guess what? I freed you. And there's a greater freedom that exists. And they allow them to be rehabilitated, and they speak the love of Jesus into their lives, and they teach them trade work so that they can get their life back. Some of these girls are married with children now and have a real life. And they're following God, and they're speaking His love to other people through the business that they're doing. This organization is unbelievable, and I can't wait to talk more about that later, but I want you to understand the picture of the rescue story because it's still happening. God's never done in the process of the rescue story. We have the ability to share our own story to help people in the aspect of their rescue because we've been rescued in those same ways. If God has drawn you out, do you hear Him calling you to come in? Because you can be drawn out, but He could still be calling you, saying, come in, come in. Maybe He hasn't even drawn you out yet. Maybe you're still struggling with that. And let me tell you, if you're still struggling with that, whether you're watching online, whether you're here this morning, if you're still struggling to figure out how God is drawing you out, talk to me. Talk to somebody in leadership. I want you guys to know what it's like to be drawn out and drawn in the love of Jesus. To have a rescue story that is greater than any rescue story you could possibly imagine. We want God to draw us out and then to draw us in. Let's pray. Father, what an epic picture of the power that you have to rescue us. You put your Spirit in place over Israel, and we see that amazing adventure that unfolds in the book of Exodus as you rescue them from a slavery, a bondage that kept them from being truly involved with you, Father. And we see that beautiful picture unfold as they come out, as you give them their instruction, you establish that constitution and that rule and the obedience that is procured through that. And Father, it's a picture for us to apply to ourselves. We are slaves to sin, Father, but when we come to that new beginning in you and we establish that relationship, you draw us out of that. And then you draw us in closer to you, for it is through you, your power, and your word that we battle against the weights of the old life. Do not let us walk out of here and take 2 steps backwards. Let us stop looking back. Let us stop relying on what might have been easier in the past or what we're used to in the past to look forward to what you have for us, each of us individually in our lives, so that we can be serving you at the fullest capacity, so that your vision can be realized, your purpose can be grown within our hearts and within our lives to move forward. Draw us out and draw us in. And we pray this, Father, in your name and your authority, and the church said, Amen.
you.